Here. Thank you for all coming on a beautiful day in Berlin. If you play golf, this is probably a good day to be out on the golf course as opposed to inside a building. I'm delighted to be here to speak about hard power, soft power, smart power, and I should give credit first. Oh. Pause. All right, how's that? All right, can you hear me? All right. I should give credit where credit is due. These terms were coined by Joseph Nye, who, as you know, is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. I should also make full disclosure, he's on the advisory board of our consulting firm, which the minister just mentioned. So I'm delighted to be able to invoke his concept. But actually, what I really want to talk about is how 2011 challenges our idea about these categories, and whether, in fact, the events of the last 6 months have made it less clear that there is a real meaningful distinction between hard power and soft power, and whether these are not really just facets of the same thing, which I think is what is really meant by smart power, is a recognition that these are all variations on a basic theme. Obviously, the dramatic event in the world in the last 6 months has been what some call the Arab Spring, the series of uprisings beginning in Tunisia with the reaction to an individual who committed suicide, and then spreading all across the Middle East, but also having reverberations around the world. I mean, to the point that I think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the other day that in China, they're now taking steps to actually crack down on dissidents and social media because they are afraid of what they're seeing in other parts of the world with this rise of popular discontent and people taking to the streets and having regimes change on account of that. But I want to suggest that while it would be easy to say that is a triumph of soft power, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And let me take you through a little bit of the recent history of all of this and then talk about what I think are some of the ambiguities in how we look at this set of events from the standpoint of hard power or soft power. You'll recall that this all began when a peddler in Tunisia who was frustrated by the fact that he was being harassed by a female police officer who had confiscated his goods, went to the police station, wanted to reclaim his goods, got what we say in the United States is the runaround. He basically was shifted from one place to another, got frustrated, and finally announced that he would kill himself. He would douse himself and set himself on fire if he didn't get his goods back, and he went to do that. And that unplugged widespread discontent in Tunisia. That spread to Egypt, Yemen, other parts of the region, and it still goes on to this point. And we see flickers of it every place from Jordan to Algeria in various shapes and forms. In some respects, we've seen some dramatic outcomes in terms of regime change. Obviously, President Mubarak is no longer in office. There's the president of Tunisia was literally chased out of office. In other parts, we see ambiguous results. In Libya, we have what appears to be kind of a stalemate between the forces that were rebelling against Gaddafi and Gaddafi himself. And in some areas, like Syria, it appears at this point that repression is the order of the day. Now, there's some obvious elements to all of this that suggest if not the triumph of soft power, the influence of soft power. In particular, people have commented on a couple of features of what we've seen in most of these areas where there has been the phenomenon of people taking to the streets and protesting and demanding change. One element of this is the use of social media, but I want to be clear, I think it's not so much limited to the issue of Facebook and Twitter. It is a broader range of media, including the old-fashioned, but nevertheless still very powerfully persuasive television. A lot of what I think has driven people in other parts of the region to begin to adopt some of the techniques and tactics that they've seen in places like Libya and Egypt and Tunisia was Al Jazeera, which showed images on a regular basis throughout the region of people rising up and then some pretty brutal repression. So all of these things had the capability of spreading the message of what was going on to a very broad audience. And certainly that's one area or one element of cultural power and soft power. The other, perhaps more interesting element of soft power as it relates to this is the rhetoric that people have been using. You know, there was a debate for a long period of time about whether using the language of democracy and human rights and freedom was an appropriate language to use in discussing some of the challenges in the Middle East. And there were people who believed that freedom and democracy are universal values and that appeal to these values will resonate throughout the world. And I have to say, under the president that I served, President Bush, he was a very strong believer that these are, in fact, universal values that can be cherished and endorsed by people around the world. There are others who perhaps take what is sometimes described as a realist view, could also be described as a cynical view, that, in fact, democracy is a local phenomenon, and that in many parts of the world it's not particularly suited to be the governing form of the appropriate form of government, and that the value does not appeal to everybody, and that therefore we should not treat it as a universal phenomenon. What's interesting about what we have seen in almost all of the areas where there has been demonstration and popular discontent is that the language and the rhetoric of democracy and freedom and human rights has been, in fact, the rhetoric that was spontaneously adopted. And I would argue this is actually a very powerful illustration that the classic idea of soft power does have a lot of weight. Remember, it's not a question of, as Marx said, a single institution trying to promote this. This was really adopted almost spontaneously by all of the students and the other people who took to the streets in Cairo or in Tunisia or in Yemen. And it wasn't because a particular country or a particular group was pushing the set of values. It was, again, a rather organic spread of the values through the internet, through television, and through word of mouth. And if you want to talk about maybe the epitome of what people think of when they talk about soft power, it is the ability to mobilize literally tens of thousands of people by using the power of an idea. Now, having said that, I want to go back to my original thesis, which is that it's not quite as simple as that. Let's take a look, for example, at Egypt. Obviously the getting out in the street and demonstrating is an important demonstration of soft power. But there were some elements of hard power, too. When you bring a lot of people into an area and they have physically occupy it, it does create a certain amount of pressure. And although I think the demonstrators were careful to avoid the use of violence, there's no doubt that the physical weight, the physical mass of people in the street did have an effect, almost an intimidating effect, that drove the army and the government to begin to make concessions. A better example of how hard power and soft power sometimes begin to get very difficult to distinguish between is Libya. In Libya, what began as people demonstrating with soft power has now morphed into a classic military conflict. And the soft power ceased to work when the people in the government refused to be moved either by the persuasiveness of the argument or by the relatively peaceful massing of protesters in a particular area. In other words, the model that Gaddafi took was not to attempt to make concessions to diffuse the situation, but was to simply threaten to kill all of his enemies. And that forced the adherents of soft power to arm themselves. And one of the things we've seen, frankly, over the last couple of months, sad to say, is that soft power doesn't the skill at mobilizing soft power does not necessarily translate into the skill at mobilizing hard power. If you're not trained, if you're not armed, and if you don't have proper leadership, you can be overwhelmed from the hard power standpoint. So that's an example where I would argue that the line between soft and hard power crossed very quickly, and the distinction between the two was eroded, and the ability of soft power to mobilize was undercut by the failure of the hard power by those who were protesting against Gaddafi. So I think what that says to me is that the use of hard power or soft power cannot be viewed as a static strategy. The appropriateness of using one or the other will depend a lot on the circumstances, and most notably on the conditions that are imposed by, for example, those who are resisting change. If they're prepared to be very brutal and very military, soft power may wind up being insufficient, and hard power may be a necessary part of the solution as well. At the same time, there's a flip side to this, which is the ability of hard power to be successful often depends upon the ability to translate that success into a meaningful, persuasive explanation and almost public representation of what has happened. And I'll explain what I mean by referring to a book I read a couple of years ago called Failing to Win. The thesis of the book was that military victory, which is the essence of hard power, very rarely is a function of just overwhelming success with the force of arms. What it often depends upon is the perception that people have about whether you have been successful or not. In other words, how do you measure what has occurred through the force of arms against the expectations that people have in terms of victory? A classic example of this is the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive, if you actually look at the history, was an effort by the North Vietnamese who had been conducting guerrilla warfare against the South Vietnamese government and against the United States military in Vietnam. They launched a conventional style attack on cities in South Vietnam. That was a major tactical change. And they were very badly beaten. In fact, in classically military terms, it was a loss for the North Vietnamese. But the challenge for the United States was that the mere mounting of the attack and the ability of the attackers to be engaged in more or less equal terms with the American military for a period of time challenged the expectation that the U.S. military was so dominant in the field that nobody could even climb into the ring and have a fair fight with them. So the discrepancy between the expectations about the U.S. military and the reality of what happened translated what should have been viewed as an American victory into an American defeat. And that's what I mean about hard power requiring soft power to achieve success. The ability to capitalize upon even the most visible hard power victories depends upon your ability to explain what has happened and to measure it in terms that the general population will agree with. So to translate that to the issues that we face at hand, throughout the back and forth in the Arab Spring, a critical issue will be what constitutes victory? How do you translate a success into something that will be perceived as a success? And that will work on both sides. And that is very much still a work in progress. So what I'd suggest is that the line between the two is a line that wavers, that is sometimes imperceptible, and can be very difficult sometimes to discern exactly where to draw that line. Now, we had in the last couple of weeks a great example of classic hard power. And that was, of course, the killing of Osama bin Laden. And, I have to say, in terms of an illustration of hard power at its best, or at its most effective, to use a more neutral term, it'd be hard to go beyond this example. It was a surgically executed strike. There was essentially no collateral damage. Nobody who was an innocent civilian was injured. There were no casualties for the American military. And in terms of the goal of eliminating the leader of al-Qaeda, it was a completely successful goal. And anybody who doubts the value and importance of hard power can use this as an example about how hard power can be critical. That being said, I come back to my earlier point. The ultimate success of this operation will also depend on a somewhat less concrete issue of the perception that people have about what happened. So, for example, it became very important right after the operation for the United States to demonstrate that they had, in fact, gotten bin Laden, that it was not a hoax or a conspiracy or something that was fabricated. And that's why you saw that within a matter of days, the United States was out using artifacts that had been found in the compound, including videotapes of bin Laden rehearsing various types of messages he wanted to send. They put this out there as a way of proving or validating that bin Laden, in fact, had been killed. And think about the significance of this. You know, in the old days, the mission ended when you killed the enemy. That was it. No one worried about the public relations dimension. But now it's not a victory unless you have persuaded the world it's a victory. And I suggest to you there'll be back and forth about this over a period of weeks as a counter argument, no matter how fanciful it is, a counter argument is mounted. Either that bin Laden wasn't really killed, it wasn't really bin Laden, or a version on this is the whole question of, well, he was unarmed, therefore does it mean it wasn't a righteous killing, but it was an illegal killing. All of these issues, which really go to the essence of how people think, will become part of ultimately determining how this operation is perceived. Now, I'm quite confident in the end it'll be perceived positively, but my point is that even in the classic case of hard power, the ability to explain and justify and lay out a vision of what has occurred becomes an important ingredient in defining whether you've been successful or not. And that's an example where I'd say hard power uses soft power in order to achieve its objective. So my conclusion, I'll be interested in what others say during the course of the conference, is that these are all dimensions of the same basic proposition. And I would argue it boils down to two words. In the 21st century, what power in general is about network and narrative. What do I mean by that? First of all, by network, I mean the ability to define action in the political sphere and the international sphere is no longer dominated by hierarchical structures and nation states. The power is now much more widely diffused over networks. And when you have networks, how you motivate people to behave is different than what you do in top-down hierarchical structures. You have to use much more persuasion. You have to use much more psychology and social psychology. And, of course, you do have to use physical power. But it's a much more subtle and a much more comprehensive approach. And that network phenomenon, which is a part of the 21st century, is changing the way power is wielded and deployed in the sphere of international and domestic relations. What do I mean by narrative? Well, I will confess to you I really hate the word narrative, largely because you hear it all the time now. Everything is a narrative. Everybody has a narrative. But I think what narrative does capture is the idea that when you get a lot of different facts, how those are perceived and how people assimilate them and what conclusions they draw, which is how they get motivated, has a lot to do with presenting the facts in a form that fits people's kind of preconceived notions about the way the world is, or that alters people's preconceived notions about the way the world is. Because remember, if you're motivating networks of people, you can't just use physical force. You've got to get them to actually take the steps that they need to take in order to achieve the results you want to achieve. And that means you've got to motivate them. And you motivate people by presenting facts and presenting theories in a particular way. So I would argue that everything that's going on, whether it was the killing of bin Laden, whether it's what's going on in the so-called Arab Spring, or anything else that's going on in the world where there's conflict and disagreement, is about these two things, network and narrative. And that's where power is going to be in the 21st century. Before I conclude and throw it open to questions or arguments or comments, let me leave by saying there's a big piece of this process of hard power, soft power, smart power, or of what I call network and narrative, that now lives in the world of religion. Religion has become a major factor in international relations and in fact, even in domestic society. And if you think about it, that makes sense. It makes sense because religious institutions are often the focal point of networks, and in many parts of the world, the only networks that exist outside of formal government hierarchies. And second, because religions tend to speak to the issue of narratives. Religions give people, from the time that they are first raised as children, a vision of the way the world works, through which all the facts can be integrated. And once that vision is in place, it's very hard to change it. And how people react to the facts may be very different depending on the vision that they have. And that means increasingly those who are involved in issues like counterterrorism or international policy or similar types of issues have to think about how they interact with the religious world. In the U.S., there's a very kind of well-settled idea that we keep the religious world, the world of faith, and the world of government in two separate spheres. And that's worked well in avoiding a certain kind of friction that you find in other parts of the world. But it also means it's difficult for government institutions and government officials to engage and discuss with religious leaders about issues that, in fact, are very, very much at the core of network and narrative and the use of power, because so much of what goes on in the world does, in fact, take place in the name of religion. In other parts of the world, the religious and the governmental are completely intertwined, and that creates a whole separate set of problems in terms of competing power centers and in terms of how interpretation of religious doctrine winds up affecting actual behavior in the real world, including things like, do we develop nuclear bomb capabilities? So part of what we need to talk about when we talk about cultural diplomacy is how we engage with the religious sector and the world of religious thought as we talk about many of the concepts like war and peace, order and disorder, freedom and opportunity, and on the other side, repression and bigotry. It's a very challenging environment. It's one in which the media has a huge impact on the way we think about all these things. And of course, one of the perils of talking about these kinds of issues in the 21st century is that between the time I began my talk and the time I'm ending, maybe something happened in Egypt that has completely blown up my theory of the way the world works. So if that's happened, be tolerant of the fact that I've been disconnected from the internet for the last 20 or 25 minutes. Anyway, that's my thesis, and I'd be delighted to throw it open to questions or comments.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Testing. Okay. Thank you very, very much, Secretary Chertoff, for, I think, a very thought-provoking presentation and also inspiring in many ways. So I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments and your challenges to everything that Secretary Chertoff has presented. What I would suggest is, since we have a lot of participants here, I want to hear as many voices as possible. If you could limit your questions to 30 seconds. That'll be our 30-second rule. So don't give another lecture yourself, but definitely ask your question in an efficient way. If you could also please stand and then introduce yourself briefly. Just say where you're from. That would be helpful for us as well, since we have a very diverse audience. And yeah, that's it. So I see the first hand is already up in the back, and then if you could please stand up, as I said, and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since I have only 30 seconds, it may not be necessary to introduce myself within 30 seconds. So
Where are you from?
I'm from Nigeria. I want to ask you about the case of the killing of bin Laden, which you have raised, more so in your capacity as the former Secretary for Homeland Security. You said this was a classical example of the use of hard power, which I agree with you entirely. But I want you to conceptualize that within the context of international law, like going into a sovereign country without the consent of the sovereign country, killing somebody, albeit a wanted person, unarmed. And after that, of course, the massive use of the soft power. So how do you justify that more so in your former capacity, as I mentioned.
All right,
Thank
so for those who, just to make sure everybody understands the question, I think it's the questions raised by killing bin Laden, an individual who was in a sovereign state, Pakistan. According to news reports, the operation was undertaken without prior consultation. The question says he's unarmed. I guess there's a little bit of a difference of opinion about whether there was a weapon in the room. But let's assume for the sake of argument he wasn't able to get to the weapon very quickly. And how does that all fit with concepts of hard power and soft power? We could have a whole talk about this, which is an interesting issue. And I would argue that part of what it reflects is the changes in the law of war and changes in the kind of international legal regime that have come about because of the fact that in the 21st century, a lot of the classical ideas of what it meant to be at war have simply been outmoded by the way people are conducting wars. Let's take a look at bin Laden. Let's unpack this for a minute. Based on the evidence that's been revealed, it appears that he was continuing to be active in directing ongoing illegal military operations against the United States in the West. And when I say illegal, I think everybody agrees that trying to blow up civilian trains or planes is illegal under the laws of war. And there's no question that he was engaged in promoting it and planning it and advocating it on a going forward basis, using his position as leader of Al-Qaeda. So I think I would argue it would be hard to see how he would not be viewed as a combatant, albeit an illegal combatant, one who is violating the laws of war. So it does raise the challenge. How do you deal with that in light of the fact that he was in a sovereign country, Pakistan? And that in turn raises the question, what are the rights of someone to act in self-defense or to pursue the activities of combat in a hard power situation when the country in which one of the combatants is located themselves is either unable or unwilling to take care of the problem itself? To use an example, if I'm sitting in my backyard and my neighbor has someone sitting in his backyard, and that individual in my neighbor's backyard is throwing Molotov cocktails or bombs into my yard, and my neighbor's unwilling or unable to do anything about it, and there's no international police force to come in and do the job, am I entitled to defend myself by doing it myself? And I would argue the answer to that is yes. But here's the most interesting part. If you look at a fair amount of what bin Laden was doing, it was rehearsing the messages that he was intending to send out as part of his operational activity. And this, I think, reinforces my earlier point, which is, as illegal as it is, and as abhorrent as it is, acts of bombing and similar terrorist acts are, of course, hard power. You're killing people. But bin Laden's understanding, in order to make effective use of the hard power, is he had to translate that into a narrative, which he does with these messages. Now, it's obviously a preposterous narrative, so I want to be clear about that. But nevertheless, I think it illustrates the point. He understands that to translate the acts of violence into his definition of success, he has to build a narrative around what he's done. And that's why so much of his time is apparently been spent on crafting these messages, as unpersuasive as they may be, because he thinks that this is what he needs to do in order to really carry out and achieve the success that he's hoping to achieve through these bombings. So I would argue, in fact, that the killing of bin Laden illustrates my thesis, that whether you begin with soft power, ultimately you may have to use hard power as an enabler. And if you begin with hard power, you have to use soft power as an enabler. And we get to debate the legality of what happened. I think it was completely legal. But for purposes of my thesis, I think it actually demonstrates that these two concepts are not separate, but they actually wind up reinforcing each other.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the next question is here. Can you come to the front?
My name's Richie. I work here at the ICD. Before the wave of revolutions in the Middle East, Western states had a policy of cooperation and arguably friendship with authoritarian regimes in the area, probably best highlighted by the fact that President Obama's first trip abroad was to Egypt. Now the Western powers are condemning the same regimes, they're collaborating with rebels fighting against them, and they're using airstrikes against them also, but still supporting other authoritarian regimes in the area. Aren't these double standards by the Western powers? Aren't they undermining every soft power effort that the Western powers are using? And how do we explain the double standards?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the things that has been very challenging, and again, it comes back to this word I hate, but it turns out to have a lot of utility, which is narrative. It's been very hard to come up with a narrative about what the West should do and is doing with respect to the Middle East. You know, you can take each country and explain why the West is behaving in certain ways from a tactical standpoint. It's hard to come up with an overarching story. You know, I would say if you go back some years, with varying degrees of intensity, there were statements by the West that regimes in the region should respect democracy and human rights. And I remember, I think in 2007, I think Secretary of State Rice went to Egypt and gave a speech about human rights that was not really well received by the regime. At various times, the U.S. administrations have gone to China and spoken aggressively about human rights, but to be candid, there are other times that they go to China and they're very quiet about it. Tactically, you can explain this as recognizing that in some circumstances there are degrees of repression, and so some situations cry out for objection more than others. You can argue it's also an issue of efficacy. You know, when it's worth while to do something because you may have an impact, that's an impetus to do it. If you think you're not going to have an impact, then you shouldn't spend the capital on it. But those are very tactical responses. And here's what's even more complicated. We shouldn't necessarily assume that those who rebel are going to turn out to be better than those they're rebelling against. You know, for those of you who remember the Who song, I think it's Baba O'Reilly, Meet the New Boss, same as the old boss. Revolutions have a way of sometimes surprising you. So one could get out and argue in favor of an uprising and discover at the end that what replaced the original regime is not much different or potentially worse. I guess my best answer to you, and you raise a troubling question because we don't have a uniform narrative. I mean, in general, we agree you have to have human rights, you have to have respect for women, you have to have rule of law and democracy. I think most of us believe it's good to transition to that over time, and that's the best way to get there, that a sudden blow up leads to unpredictable results. But how we actually give voice to that and when we get involved and when we don't get involved do tend to get driven by pragmatic grounds. I think obviously when you look at Libya and Syria, it's hard to see a big difference between Gaddafi and Assad in terms of how they're treating their own people. There's a practical difference. For Europe, Libya is closer than Syria and raises issues that are much more at the heart of European security concerns than Syria does. And also, to be honest, it's easier to get engaged in Libya, which is across the Mediterranean and which is basically, most of the population is along a coastal strip. The ability of Europeans to project power into Syria would be much more challenging. So there's a practical limiting principle to the hard power that may be influencing a little bit about our soft power views.
Okay, I see now many questions have actually come. I'm going to try to go in order. I think Sir James, I know, but right before that there was someone here, if I remember correctly. If you can help me, I forget now who was first. I just saw a hand over here. Do you guys know? Or? All right, I'll trust you. You can help me. So we'll take your question first, and then Sir James.
Okay, thanks, Mark. This is more to do with your last answer. I was just wondering, do you think it's not in the United States' interest and the West's interest that democracy is not established in the Middle East and the so-called Spring Offensive, because it's probably more dangerous because of the age profile of most of those states, and the possible link with radical ideas. Thanks.
Well, so again, for those who didn't hear it, the question is democracy actually in the interest of the West and the United States and the Middle East? Because you could wind up with a group taking power that has very radical ideas. There's no question that democracy and the rule of law, particularly democracy, can have unexpected results. And actually, we should unpack it a little bit, because I've come to think over time that the predicate to an effective democracy is the rule of law. You have to begin with the rule of law, and then you can get an effective democracy. When you start with a democracy and you don't have the rule of law, that can easily become an arbitrary type of government. Because a democracy without the rule of law can lead to majority oppression of the minority. Look what's going on in Egypt now. There's conflict now between the Muslims and the Christians. If that were to develop and to progress, then the trajectory of the revolution in Egypt might not appear to be such a benign trajectory. There could be some unfortunate outcomes. So in an ideal world, I would say that what you would want to see is moving forward with a framework of a rule of law and rights, and then have democracy built within that framework. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world, and these things get started, and sometimes one element of the change exceeds the other. I do think where the West has an interest, though, is in assisting to help new democracies, if in fact this is where these countries are headed, set up the kind of framework of respect for rights, including minority rights, rule of law, and reasonable good order, setting those things up at the outset, because those will be important principles if democracies are going to keep on track. If democracies are developed and they don't have these principles, then it's not at all far-fetched to imagine that a party could come into power that would be as distasteful as anything that existed under Mubarak's regime. So I do think that helping to shape democracy by creating a framework within which it operates is an important part of the values the West can contribute to this process.
Okay, we're over time, but I want to take two more brief questions if possible. First of all, Advisory Board Member and Founding President of the Seychelles, Sir James Menchem.
Thank you, sir. I would like to make a statement and then invite your comment. It appears to me that many nations who are now projecting the idea of soft power are doing so against a background of hard power. And what is disturbing and very sad is this dimension of hard power itself is based on a changed notion, whereas it used to be that right is might. Today it seems that might is right.
Well, I would argue that actually, again, in line with my original thesis, that hard power and soft power coexist, and they're kind of simultaneous. And the movement back between one and the other is very fluid and sometimes very hard to distinguish between. I would argue it's hard that there's not a hard and fast distinction between might is right and right is might. I think right can be might. I mean, having approval, moral status, and a perception that what you're doing is the right thing does have an important motivating force, including in terms of your hard power. It does allow you to exercise hard power because you get support. Contrary, if you have a lot of disapproval of your hard power, it doesn't prevent you from using it, but it makes it much harder. But I would argue that, at the same time, your ability to use hard power sometimes puts you in a position to advance views that are righteous views. I mean, we've had conflicts in the past where had one side won and another lost, the conception of what right and what's just and proper would have been very, very different. So again, I would argue that the cleavage between the two is a little less distinct and a little less organic than we might think. That there's a real, I mean, I guess the Chinese would say a real yin and yang, a back and forth between these various concepts.
And the final question here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Martí Estruc. I represent the government of Catalonia in Germany. And my question to you is whether you think that the growing need of network and discourse or narrative could be due to the fact that hard power or the actors of hard power have been losing the control of classical media because of social media growth and democratization of information. Thank you.
I would say that's partly true. I would say the democratization of information has made network and narrative more important because the institutions of disseminating information have become more dispersed. But there's another reason why, another factor of the 21st century that has done it, and that is hard power has become much more widely dispersed. I mean, this is kind of a maybe a blunt thing to say, but in the 21st century, the ability of small groups of people to carry out acts of destruction that used to require a nation state, that power has grown enormously. And, 100 years ago, a group of people in a network might set off a bomb, a small bomb, or they might shoot somebody. We're living in an age now where we're close to having small groups being able to actually trigger a weapon of mass destruction, a biological weapon, a serious chemical weapon, something on the internet. The monopoly of hard power that used to be enjoyed by the nation state is now broken down. So part of the reason network and narrative become important is because the dispersal of the hard power means that small groups can be a much bigger threat than would have been the case 100 years ago. And that means you've got to find a way to motivate bigger networks and other networks to push back against networks that would cause destruction and havoc. There's been a general democratization of power around the world. Some of it is in terms of communication and ideas. Some of it is in terms of bomb making and conjuring up weapons with serious destructive consequences. Maybe the first is good, the second is surely bad, but like it or not, that's the world in which we live. And that's why I think we're still trying to come to grips with how to deal with this dispersal of power in a world where globalization has meant nobody's insulated. And what happens in one part of the world has impact on the other. I'll leave you with this thought about September 11th. There are a lot of things you could say for the U.S. from the U.S. standpoint about September 11th, 2001, but I think there's one point that's pertinent here. Prior to September 11th, rightly or wrongly, I think most Americans believed that the U.S. could choose to participate in history or not to participate in history. That the two oceans protected the United States, that when the U.S. engaged in historical events and wars or things of that sort, it was by choice. And if the U.S. didn't want to engage or be interested in what happened in a particular part of the world, the U.S. would simply choose not to do so. 9/11 demonstrated to Americans that, like it or not, like everybody else, we are part of history. And if we don't act, history will act upon us. And things that occur in remote places in the world, like parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan that nobody in the United States, hardly anybody had ever heard of, could have a direct, huge impact on the lives of people in New York and Virginia and other places in the country. So I think the reason that there's a particular interest in these issues and in cultural diplomacy and global cultures in the United States now, after 9/11, is because this idea that we could remove ourselves from the globe was, in a rather brutal and tragic and atrocious way, dissipated on September 11th. And that's, I think, been a major thought shift for the United States. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Secretary Michael Chertoff.